They didn't take my boat. They didn't take my car. They didn't even touch my house. No, what they took was my dock. Walked right onto my land, pointed at the dock I built myself with nothing but elbow grease, and announced, "This is Brent's." Now, Brent, he's her son. No job, glued to his phone, full of entitlement. Oh, and I'm Darren. I'm an engineer. Not the kind who shouts, usually, but that day, I came close. Everything spiraled out of control so quickly, I'm still shocked I didn't completely lose it. Have you ever had something taken from you like that, really taken? If so, drop it in the comments. I'd honestly like to hear your story. Never in a million years did I think I'd be one of those people caught up in neighborhood drama. I'm 35. I work a full-time engineering job. All I wanted was to come home, sit on the dock I built, and enjoy a quiet cup of coffee. For years, that was my morning ritual, me, my coffee, the lake, and peace. That all shattered the day Brent arrived. The dock, about 20 feet of sturdy, hand-built woodwork, was my personal escape. Not fancy, but solid, code-compliant, and mine. It wasn't just lumber and nails, it was my safe haven. But peace like that doesn't last forever, especially when new neighbors move in thinking the world spins just for them. The whole mess kicked off about 2 months after Pamela Sloan moved in 3 houses down. Pamela was hard to miss. Perfect blonde bob like she just left the salon, clipboard always in hand like she was campaigning for something, and some kind of walkie-talkie she never put down. Within a week, she'd somehow managed to install herself as the new HOA president. In hindsight, I should have questioned how fast that happened. But back then, I didn't care about HOA politics. I figured if no one bothered me or my dock, we'd be fine. Man, was I wrong. The first red flag. Her son, Brent, mid-20s maybe, face always lit by the glow of his phone screen. Didn't seem to have a job again. I'm not judging, but there was just something off. He didn't stroll around like a neighbor. He loitered, hands jammed into the pockets of that oversized hoodie, eyes locked on my dock like he was waiting for it to invite him over. At first, he just wandered by, stopping to look at the dock now and then. Nothing threatening, maybe curious. I shrugged it off. But then he kept coming back. And not just to look, he started setting up shop. A cooler showed up, then a folding chair, then that Bluetooth speaker just loud enough to break the silence. I'd grown to love. I tried to be reasonable. Maybe he didn't realize it was private. Maybe his mom didn't explain the boundaries. The dock sits right on the lake. Maybe from a distance, someone could think it was shared. I told myself I was overthinking, but each time I saw him there, something in my gut twisted. So I stayed quiet. At first, but by week 4, he upped the ante. Brought snacks, more gear, and worst of all, he left garbage. Chip bags, soda cans, sandwich wrappers just left lying there. I'd find myself out there in the evenings cleaning up after him, thinking, he has to know this isn't public space. This wasn't an accident anymore. The tipping point came on a Tuesday morning. I walked out to start my day, coffee in hand, and there he was, laid out on the bench I usually sit on, feet up, beer can in hand. And not just any beer can, he'd set it right on top of my old design catalog I'd accidentally left the night before. A beer. At 8 a.m. I inhaled deeply, walked over, and as calmly as I could, said, "Hey, this is private property." He looked up at me, gave a shrug, and went right back to scrolling. No apology, no acknowledgement, just silence and the soft tapping of his thumb on the screen. I stood there, waiting 10 seconds, maybe more, hoping he'd at least respond. Nothing. I opened my mouth to say something else, something I might have regretted, when I heard voices drifting over from Pamela's yard. I couldn't catch it all, but what I heard chilled me. Heading back toward my house, unsure what to do, I heard Pamela talking on the phone. Just keep him out there every day. People get used to seeing things, it starts to feel normal. I stopped in my tracks, frozen, hiding in the shadows between our yards. I listened. Give it a few weeks, and we'll make it official. No one questions what's already been happening. I couldn't see her, but I heard the triumph in her voice. That's when it hit me. This wasn't a clueless kid pushing boundaries. This was a strategy. Pamela was orchestrating a slow takeover, and Brent was her pawn. Everything suddenly made sense. The way he ignored me, the escalation, the timing. They were working together. I felt a flood of anger and disbelief. Who does that? Who moves into a neighborhood and immediately starts scheming to take your property? And then I remembered the clipboard. The walkie-talkie, how fast she'd climbed. Into the HOA presidency. Pamela wasn't just meddling, she was executing a plan. And apparently, I was her next conquest. 3 silent mornings passed. Then, a thick envelope landed in my mailbox like a brick through a window. Standing in my driveway, flipping through the usual junk, I saw it. Homeowners Association, urgent community matter, stamped in bold red ink. I tore it open right then and there. What I read made me question whether I was still living. In reality, it was like someone had taken scissors to the truth and pasted over it with a bad fake. The letter claimed my dock had been reclassified as community waterfront access. And get this, Brent Sloan had been appointed as the official waterfront coordinator, supposedly to meet special community needs. Community access, my dock wasn't even visible from the road. You had to cut through my backyard to reach it. And a waterfront coordinator. What was that even supposed to mean? Nap supervision and trash distribution. The letter was signed by something called the Emergency Community Board and countersigned by the former board secretary. That name sounded familiar. I pulled out my old HOA documents and sure enough, she'd moved away 4 months ago. I even called her old number. Her voicemail confirmed what I suspected. She hadn't been part of any HOA decisions since March. So, not only was the whole thing fabricated, they forged a signature from someone who didn't even live here anymore. How dumb did they think I was? Or maybe more importantly, how dumb did they think everyone else was? I mean, surely people had noticed that secretary hadn't been around in months. Then again, who really pays attention to HOA meetings? Most folks keep their heads down and try to avoid trouble. Maybe Pamela was counting on that. Maybe she figured, if the paperwork looked official, nobody would dig deeper. It was a calculated risk and honestly, it might have worked. On someone else, but not on me. I'm an engineer. I'm trained to double-check every line, every number, every assumption. I once caught a drainage miscalculation on a city project that saved $500,000. And now, those same instincts were kicking in. I treated the whole scheme like a technical review. I picked it apart, blueprint style, found the cracks, traced every flaw. Property agreements, old surveys, CHOA bylaws, county documentation, you name it. I had it on my table. And the inconsistencies, they were everywhere. First, red flag, there wasn't a single regulation anywhere that allowed private land to be converted to shared use. Not one. The community access rules only applied to areas already designated as shared property, and my dock had been constructed entirely within the boundaries of my own lot. Secondly, the whole emergency community board scenario, total fabrication. Per the bylaws, any alterations to property status required a vote by the full membership, with a minimum of 30 days notice. So, I called the HOA office to get clarity on this supposed emergency meeting. The receptionist seemed caught off guard. She put me on hold for about 5 minutes, then came back saying that Mrs. Sloan had gotten everything cleared through the proper channels and there had been sufficient community feedback. I pressed her for specifics. What vote? When did it occur? Who attended? She responded by saying Mrs. Sloan would give me a call to explain. That was on a Thursday. By Monday, Pamela still hadn't reached out, but Brent had clearly interpreted the so-called official notice as permission to turn my dock into his personal hangout. We're talking folding chair, a cooler stocked with beer, even a small portable table where he propped up his phone to stream videos. It was like he'd relocated his entire afternoon routine onto my land, and I felt like an innkeeper who never agreed to open a bed and breakfast. It might have been funny if it hadn't been so outrageously disrespectful. Here was this grown adult squatting on my dock like he owned it, while his mother hid behind bogus paperwork and forged signatures. The wildest part, other neighbors began acting like it was normal. One afternoon, Mrs. Miller, who lives next door, walked by and gave Brent a wave like he belonged there. The Johnsons casually mentioned how nice it was to see the dock getting some use. It was like Pamela's scheme was actually working. People were adjusting to the sight of Brent lounging on my property, and before long, they'd likely assume that was just how things were supposed to be. I started wondering how many other neighborhood norms had started this way, someone bold enough to do something until no one questioned it anymore. That's when I spotted Greg, Pamela's husband, for the first time in any meaningful way. I'd seen him around before, but never paid much attention. Middle-aged, quiet type, kept mostly to himself. But one evening, I was watching Brent make his usual mess on my dock from my kitchen window when I noticed Greg step into their backyard. He stood there for a moment, staring at the scene, then shook his head and walked back inside. There was something in his posture that told me he didn't entirely approve of what was happening. I started to wonder, did he even know what Pamela was up to, or was he just as clueless as the rest of us? Either way, it was clear not everyone in that household supported her ridiculous plan. That's when I stopped sitting back and decided it was time to fight back. That Friday, I contacted a property attorney and explained the entire situation. He listened patiently as I read the fake HOA letter aloud. When I finished, he paused for a beat and said, "Well, that's certainly imaginative." He agreed to draft and send a cease and desist letter, directed both at the HOA and Pamela personally, demanding they stop trespassing and rescind their fraudulent claims. He also advised me to begin collecting evidence, photos, videos, times, dates, and witnesses so we'd have a solid trail if this ever went to court. Holding that forged letter in my hands, I realized I was caught in a game I didn't yet understand. But did they really know who they were up against? The cease and desist hit Pamela like a thunderclap. Her reaction, let's just say it wasn't calm or professional. My lawyer sent it on a Tuesday. By Wednesday morning, my phone was ringing. Like clockwork, every hour Pamela screaming about harassment, legal intimidation, and how I was targeting a family in need. At 2:13 a.m., she left a voicemail that began with threats of legal action and ended in sobs about preserving community spirit. I saved every single message. During the first call, I genuinely tried to reason with her. I explained that the dock sat entirely on my property, that the letter contained forged signatures, and that if she truly wanted to discuss shared access, there were legitimate processes in place for that. But talking to Pamela was like arguing with a hurricane. She'd drown out everything I said, yelling louder and louder, until I eventually hung up only for her to immediately call back. By Thursday, the phone calls had escalated into something more aggressive, a neighborhood-wide smear campaign. She started going door to door, telling anyone who would listen that I was selfish and anti-community. According to her version of events, I was blocking public access to a community waterfront and denying a young man the chance to rest and heal. She painted Brent as some kind of innocent victim, being harassed by a heartless, wealthy neighbor guarding the lakefront like a dragon. The wealthy part was almost laughable. I'm an engineer, not a tech billionaire. I bought this house because it was the smallest lakefront property available, and even that pushed my budget. But here's the thing about gossip, it doesn't need to be true to do damage. Within a week, I felt the shift in how people saw me. Mrs. Miller, who used to stop and chat about her garden while I checked the mail, suddenly had urgent errands whenever I approached. The Johnsons stopped waving when I drove by. Someone, probably Brent or Pamela, started tossing bits of trash on my lawn every few days. Not enough to cause a scene, just enough to make a point. I kept thinking, how did I become the villain here? All I wanted was to use my own dock. It felt like some twisted version of high school, where the popular girl convinces everyone you're the problem and the truth didn't matter as much as the narrative people preferred. That dock wasn't just playing sand nails to me. My father's ashes had been scattered there. My niece had cast her first fishing line from that spot. To everyone else, it might have been wood. To me, it was a place filled with memories. The lowest point came one Saturday afternoon. I'd had enough of Brent treating my dock like a personal amusement park. I stormed out and confronted him, probably more harshly than I should have. "Get off my dock." Now, I shouted loud enough for neighbors to hear. Brent didn't argue. Instead, he pulled out his phone and started filming, smirking as he captured me completely losing my cool. And just like that, they had what they needed. A shaky video of a man pushed to his breaking point. Not a villain, not a hero, just a guy unraveling. No doubt Pamela got her hands on it within hours, using it as proof of my hostile behavior toward her vulnerable son. I felt like a stranger in my own neighborhood. Maybe I was being dramatic. Maybe I should have just let him use the dock and tried to strike a compromise. But every time I looked at my dock, the one I built with my own hands, and saw him using it like a personal lounge, the fury returned. Was I being unreasonable, or just holding my ground? All I knew was that caving now would set a dangerous precedent, that anyone could claim what was mine if they were persistent enough. So I chose to fight smarter. First step, I hired a licensed surveyor to formally mark the property lines. No more debate about where my land ended and the shared space began. I wanted black and white proof that would stand in court. While I waited on the survey results, I began collecting evidence meticulously. Photos of Brent on the dock, timestamps, videos of the trash he left behind. One clip caught him tossing sandwich wrappers like it was his own backyard. Another showed Pamela whispering into a walkie-talkie while pointing at my dock, like she was orchestrating a heist. Neighbors might have thought I was overreacting, but to me, this was just another engineering challenge, one I intended to solve. That's when Mary approached me. She was an older woman who lived 2 houses down from Pamela and had been in the neighborhood for 2 decades. One day, while I was out watering plants, probably looking pretty drained, she wandered over and said quietly, "That boy's not really her son, you know." I blinked in surprise. Mary glanced around before continuing. "She took him in a few years ago after his parents passed. But between us, I don't think she wanted a son, I think she wanted someone to use." The way she said use gave me chills. I asked what she meant, but Mary just shook her head and said, "Keep your eyes open, dear. This isn't the first time she's tried to expand her turf." When the survey came back, it confirmed exactly what I already knew. The dock was 100% on my property. No ambiguity, no shared claim. Still, Mary's words kept ringing in my head. Someone to use? What exactly had she meant by that? And what other territory had Pamela tried to expand before? I began wondering how many neighbors had faced her tactics and just backed down instead of putting up a fight. That survey document felt like a trump card, but Mary's warning made me wonder just how deep this thing really went. I wasn't going to wait around anymore. The following Monday, I called Premier Fencing and ordered a 6-foot privacy fence with a locking gate designed to fully enclose the dock. I'm talking serious construction-grade materials, concrete footings and all. When the contractor brought up permits, I told him I'd take care of those myself. That same afternoon, I headed straight to City Hall and filed every bit of the required paperwork. Everything was legitimate and by the book, unlike Pamela's phony HOA letters. The permit got approved within 3 days, and I made sure to grab extra copies. I had a feeling they'd come in handy. At that point, it wasn't just about resolving an issue. It was about making a statement. Some people can't be reasoned with, they have to be outmaneuvered. On Tuesday morning, a huge delivery truck rolled in, stacked with fencing supplies, posts, panels, bags of concrete, hardware, everything lined up neatly in my driveway. No way Pamela could miss it from her kitchen window. I had taken the day off work specifically to oversee the whole thing. And honestly, watching those materials being offloaded was incredibly gratifying. That was my boundary, literally. I wasn't negotiating anymore. No more forged documents. No more strangers lounging on my dock like they owned the place. I was finally handling things the way I should have from day one, with clear, physical limits. Every beam of wood felt like a step forward, a small but solid win in reclaiming what was always mine. Pamela came storming over, gripping her clipboard like it was a sheriff's badge, but froze when I calmly held up my city permit, confronting her power trip head-on. I stood there with my coffee, probably looking more composed than I actually felt, and said, "Putting up a fence on my property. Got the permits right here." I held out the stamped, signed documents. She stared at them like they were written in another language, then launched into a rant about public access, property rights, and how I was ruining the neighborhood aesthetic. I just nodded and told her the construction team would be starting at 7 a.m. sharp. The look she gave me when she realized her intimidation tactics had hit a wall worth every penny I'd spent on the fence. Come Wednesday morning, Premier Fencing showed up right on time. The crew was sharp, well-equipped, and clearly knew their stuff. I'd planted myself in a lawn chair with a clear view of both the worksite and the Sloane's place. I knew this was going to stir something up. Sure enough, Brent was still lounging on the dock when the workers arrived. He looked completely bewildered as they began marking the fence line. The crew foreman approached him to explain what was going on. Brent looked shocked, like he truly believed squatters' rights were going to protect him. Every thought of the post driver felt like I was reclaiming more than land, like I was getting my dignity back. The smell of wet soil and sawdust in the air smelled like freedom taking shape. About an hour in, Pamela called the police. I watched her through the kitchen window, gesturing like mad while on the phone, probably accusing me of tearing down community property or building without the right paperwork. 20 minutes later, 2 officers showed up and asked to see my documentation. I handed them everything: the permits, the property survey, the deed. They reviewed it all in about 5 minutes. One officer even walked the property line with me, confirmed everything matched the official layout, then told Pamela it was a civil issue and everything I was doing was lawful. The expression on her face when they basically told her to back off priceless. Across the street, Mrs. Miller stood at her window behind the blinds, coffee in hand. She didn't wave, but she didn't look away either. By noon, the fence had started to come together. You could clearly see how it was enclosing the dock. That's when Pamela snapped. She stormed over. No clipboard, no professional act, just full-blown panic. "You can't do this. Brent needs that space," she yelled. And for the first time since all this began, I heard something in her voice that wasn't aggressive, it was desperate. This wasn't just about property lines or shared access. There was something deeper at play. I looked her in the eye and asked, "Why? Why does Brent need my dock so badly? There's tons of waterfront in this neighborhood." She paused, said nothing, and walked off, heading back to her house. But that crack in her armor left me wondering, what was she really afraid of losing? That's when Greg finally stepped in. I had been wondering where he was through all this mess and honestly started thinking maybe he was just as unhinged as his wife. But around 2 p.m., as the workers were installing gate hardware, Greg walked over. He looked older, tired. When he spoke, his voice was soft, serious. "I'm sorry, Darren, this has gone too far." He watched the crew for a moment, then said something that sent a chill down my spine. She didn't adopt Brent to help him. She needed someone to project onto, someone she could fully control. And when that wasn't enough, double quotes, he glanced toward the dock. She needed more space to control. His words hit like a brick. This wasn't just about my dock. It was part of a long pattern, years in the making. Greg kept talking, and what he revealed painted a picture of Pamela that was far more disturbing than I had imagined. According to him, she'd been eyeing my dock since the day they moved in, chose their house because she could see it from the backyard. She'd been planning to claim it ever since. Brent wasn't just a son, he was a tool. A way to test limits and stake out territory. And apparently, this wasn't the first time. She'd tried similar things with past neighbors, gradually pushing the boundaries, expanding control bit by bit. "I've been gathering proof," Greg said in a hushed tone, "for the divorce. But watching what she was doing to Brent and to you made me realize it was bigger than my marriage." He described Pamela like a chess master who saw the whole neighborhood as her board and everyone else as pawns. By evening, the fence was done. 6 feet high, solid wood, fully enclosing the dock. Heavy-duty lock on the gate. Only I had the key. The crew had done top-tier work, everything clean, aligned, and completely up to code. I walked the full perimeter, inspecting it all. It felt incredible. My property, secure and private, exactly how it always should have been. But the most satisfying part, seeing Pamela frozen on the outside, staring at the dock she could no longer touch. For once, she said nothing, not a word. The fence stood there, stark and unmoving, a physical symbol of the boundaries she had spent so long trying to erase. Brent packed his things slowly, like someone waking up from a dream. I expected him to push back or at least complain, but he didn't. He folded his chair, packed the cooler, gathered his little table, quiet and deliberate, like someone finally seeing the situation for what it was. Maybe he realized the absurdity of it all, or maybe he was just tired of being a pawn in his adoptive mother's games. Either way, watching him walk away felt like a chapter closing. The fence now stood between us and them, firm and final. I couldn't help but remember Greg's words about control and patterns. As Pamela stood silently beside it, I thought I'd feel triumphant. But instead, I just wondered. Was this really the end? Exactly 1 week after the fence went up, Pamela's world started to unravel. My attorney submitted a formal complaint to the regional HOA oversight committee. Attached were copies of her forged letters, fake meeting notes, and detailed accounts of her harassment toward me. Those regional boards don't mess around. They've seen every dirty HOA trick out there. Pamela's sloppy little operation was like an open invitation to tear it apart. They called an emergency hearing and immediately suspended her as HOA president while they launched a full investigation. The irony. She got taken down by the same emergency rules she tried to weaponize against me. Sometimes karma's got a wicked sense of humor even if you're too ticked off to laugh at the time. But the real shock came when Greg asked to meet privately. He showed up Thursday evening with a cardboard box that looked like it weighed a ton. "I should have brought this to you months ago," he said, his voice low like a confession. We sat at my kitchen table. He placed the box down gently, like it carried more than just paper, like it carried guilt. "This is long overdue," he muttered. He started pulling out documents that made everything Pamela had done seem even worse. There were email printouts outlining her strategy to slowly build community precedent over my dock, bank records showing misuse of HOA funds for her personal landscaping, and worst of all, typed up notes detailing how she emotionally manipulated Brent, as if it were a psychological operation manual. Greg spread the papers out like courtroom evidence. "Honestly, that's what it was. I was collecting this for the divorce," he said. "But after what she did to you and to Brent, I knew I couldn't keep sitting on it." He played me audio recordings of her planning future neighborhood enhancements. My dock was just step one. She already had plans to claim the Johnsons' gazebo, said Mrs. Miller's garden shed blocked a scenic view and needed to be relocated. One document stopped me cold. A spreadsheet titled Behavioral Compliance Risk. My name was listed as a level for obstruction. Level 5, completely blacked out. It wasn't just random madness, it was calculated. That's what chilled me most. But what broke me was reading how she described Brent. He wasn't a child to her. He was a tool, responds well to praise-based manipulation. Increased dependency ensures compliance with territorial expansion projects. Who thinks about their own kid that way? Greg saw me reading it and said softly, "She didn't adopt him to help. She adopted him because he had no one, so she could control him completely." It's sick, really, really sick. When I asked why he was coming forward now, his answer was simple: "Brent deserves better than being someone's pawn. And you deserve to enjoy your own land in peace." He had been planning to wait until the divorce finalized. But after seeing how she'd roped Brent into her campaign against me, he knew he couldn't wait. The regional HOA board moved quickly once they saw what Greg brought them. They summoned Pamela the following Tuesday, and after reviewing the evidence, permanently removed her as president and launched a financial misconduct investigation. They also ordered her to reimburse me fully for legal and construction costs. Apparently, if you forge documents to harass your neighbors, there are consequences. Who would have thought? But the strangest thing was Pamela's reaction. Silence. No calls, no shouting matches, no neighborhood patrols with a clipboard in hand. For the first time in months, my phone stayed quiet. It was eerie. Like the storm had passed, and this was just the debris field left behind. I told Greg later, funny thing about emergency powers, they cut both ways. Greg has since filed for full guardianship of Brent, noting the kid's ongoing struggles from early trauma. He's not going back to her, Greg said with conviction. "I don't care what has to happen legally, he's done being her pawn." Seeing Greg stand up for Brent like that made me realize the Sloans weren't all the same. Greg had been stuck in the middle of this nightmare like the rest of us. But unlike me, he didn't have the option of solving the problem by simply putting up a fence. He had to coexist with the chaos, watch it unravel relationships, manipulate a fragile young man, and quietly gather proof until he could finally take action. I couldn't imagine having that kind of patience and foresight, but I had to respect it. What truly shocked me was how the neighborhood started responding once the truth started circulating. Mrs. Miller brought over a plate of cookies with a handwritten apology. Even the Johnsons, who once praised Brent for bringing life to the lake, showed up at my door. "We had no idea," they said. "We were afraid to say anything." People I barely recognized began approaching me with their own stories about Pamela. Turns out, half the block had been on the receiving end of her manipulations in one way or another, but no one felt safe enough to speak out. It was like watching dominoes fall in reverse, everything standing upright instead of collapsing. People were finally able to admit what they'd been enduring. The way the neighborhood began healing felt natural, like we'd all been silently holding our breath and could finally let it out. 2 weeks later, Pamela quietly listed her house. No farewells, no explanations, no dramatic send-off. One Monday, a for sale sign appeared, and by the weekend, potential buyers were already touring the property. I watched from my kitchen window as the realtor showed them around. and I couldn't help but wonder what they'd think if they knew the real story behind the place. Funny how sometimes justice comes from the people you least expect. Pamela vanished as if she'd never been there at all. But watching Greg and Brent now, I started to wonder, was this truly the end, or the beginning of something better? The atmosphere felt different, like we'd all learned something meaningful about taking a stand, even when it's uncomfortable. 2 months after Pamela was gone, I finally got to enjoy my morning coffee from the dock again, behind a fence now draped in climbing roses. Thanks to gardening advice from Mrs. Miller, the sense of peace was incredible. I hadn't realized how much stress I'd been carrying until it was gone. Each morning, I'd unlock the gate, walk down to my bench, and listen to the water gently hitting the dock posts. No hostile calls, no clipboard-toting neighbor demanding answers, no 20-something acting like my property was his playground, just calm. The dock creaked beneath me like an old friend clearing its throat. I used to tune that sound out. Now, I noticed it. Now, I valued it. What changed the most, though, was Brent. Once he moved in with Greg full-time, something shifted. I'd see them outside doing yard work, and Brent looked different, more grounded, less lost. Like he'd finally found his footing. Greg enrolled him in community college part-time. The same kid who used to haunt my dock now worked behind the counter at the local hardware store. He even greeted me by name, asking about fasteners with real interest. It wasn't glamorous work, but he seemed proud of it. When I ran into him during supply runs, he looked me in the eye instead of down at the floor. Just last week, he even waved from across the parking lot. Watching him now, it felt like he was finally figuring out who he was without someone pulling his strings. One evening in late September, Greg dropped by to give me an update. We sat out back, and I'd never seen him look more at ease. Just wanted to say thanks again, he told me, and let you know the divorce was finalized last month. Pamela's 3 states away now, in some retirement community where she can be queen bee to a bunch of folks who don't know her history yet. He paused, took a sip of his beer. Honestly, I feel sorry for her new neighbors. We both laughed, but he wasn't wrong. Somewhere out there, Pamela was probably already picking her next target. Some people never learn that the world isn't theirs to control, no matter how many clipboards they carry or how official they try to sound. Watching the neighborhood begin to heal was eye-opening. Mrs. Miller didn't stop at cookies. She actually organized a community barbecue where people could finally speak freely about what they'd experienced under Pamela's watch. Turns out, she'd been leveraging community projects to tighten her grip on the block. The Johnsons talked about how she pressured them to move their gazebo. The elderly couple at the far end of the street had received threatening letters about their mailbox placement. Even the guy across the lake had stories. Pamela trying to claim water access rights that weren't hers. What I once believed was a personal attack turned out to be part of a bigger strategy to control the whole neighborhood. The new HOA president, this time elected fairly through a transparent vote, was a retired teacher who seemed to understand the job, maintain shared spaces and enforce fair standards, not redistribute private land based on who complains the loudest. She came to my house in person to apologize. We've put in new procedures, she explained. No more emergency votes, no more solo decisions, and definitely no more forged signatures. It felt good knowing something positive came from all the chaos. Sometimes, one person's extreme behavior makes everyone else see what normal is supposed to look like. Mary had once said Pamela didn't want someone to love, she wanted someone to use. But now, seeing Greg and Brent together, I saw something else. People who've been used can be stronger than anyone expects. Brent wasn't just surviving without Pamela, he was thriving. He'd found a real family instead of being manipulated into a role. Greg had become the father figure Brent actually needed, not the one Pamela assigned him to be. It proved that with the right support, people can rediscover who they are beneath all the control. 3 months after the dust settled, I made a decision about the fence. Don't get me wrong, it wasn't coming down. But I did hire someone to add a small gate facing Greg's yard. Good neighbors should be able to visit properly, I told him. The look on his face, worth every penny. It wasn't about forgetting the past or dropping my boundaries. It was about recognizing the difference between people who respect your space and those who try to take it. The fence was staying, but now it wasn't a wall between us. It was a frame for a better relationship. The best moment came one Saturday when Brent knocked at the gate and asked if he could see the dock the proper way. This time, I opened both gates and gave him the full tour, pointing out the engineering techniques behind the structure. He was genuinely interested, asking smart questions about load distribution and water resistance. "You know, I'm taking construction classes at school," he said. "Maybe sometime you could show me how the anchoring works." There he was standing on my dock, not lounging like before, but eager to learn. 3 months ago, he'd been an intruder. Now, he was a guest, one who understood the value of both the property and the boundaries around it. That growth wasn't just his, it was mine. As I watched Brent talk shop with curiosity, I realized something. Real family often comes from battles no one asked for. Greg and Brent had found each other through this mess. Our neighborhood learned how to communicate instead of just complain, and I discovered that the best way to defend what's yours isn't to lock it away but to welcome the right people in. The fence still stood, but now it felt like the base of something better. 6 months after building it, I'm back on my dock, coffee in hand, and honestly, I learned more about people and property rights through this ordeal than any textbook ever taught me. People ask all the time, was it worth the legal bills, the stress, the sleepless nights? Let me share what I've learned, because if you're dealing with your own Pamela, maybe this helps. Lesson 1. Know your rights. Seriously, understand them completely. I'm an engineer, so I research things thoroughly. But you don't need a degree to know your property lines, read your HOA bylaws, or understand homeowner rights. That knowledge is power, especially when someone waves fake paperwork or quotes made-up rules. Spend the money to get your deed and survey. Read those bylaws cover to cover. When someone confronts you with fake authority, being confident in your facts gives you a real edge. Lesson 2. Document everything. Every interaction. Photos, notes, timestamps, witnesses. Without documentation, it's just your word against theirs. With it, you've got evidence, and evidence beats emotion every time. I kept hundreds of photos, saved every phony HOA letter, and recorded every heated call. It felt like overkill, but when the lawyers got involved, it turned a messy neighbor spat into a clear-cut case of harassment. Lesson 3. Stay professional, even when they're not. This is hard. When someone's screaming lies, faking documents, and pushing your limits, your instincts want to fight fire with fire. But I made mistakes when I lost my cool, and those moments were used against me. Once I handled it like an engineering problem, logically, calmly, and with data. That's when things changed. Professionalism doesn't guarantee victory, but losing it usually guarantees failure. Lesson 4, and this surprised me, your biggest enemies aren't always who you think. I spent months blaming Brent along with Pamela. But Greg and Brent were trapped by her just like I was. Greg became one of my strongest allies because he had access to insights I never could have found alone. And Brent turned out to be a decent kid just trying to survive. Sometimes, solving the problem helps people you didn't even realize were hurting. Ultimately, this wasn't about a dock. It was about power, control, and what happens when someone believes they can take what doesn't belong to them using manipulation and pretend authority. Pamela's tactics were psychological. Normalize the behavior, make it look official, isolate the target, then frame the takeover as a compromise. If I had agreed to share the dock, it wouldn't have ended there. It would have proven her methods work, and she'd have moved on with more confidence. So here's the update. The dock is still standing now with better security and those climbing roses that make the fence feel intentional, not defensive. Brent graduated with honors and got a full-time job in construction. Greg remarried a woman who treats Brent like family, not a burden. The HOA now runs with full transparency, real community involvement, and no shady dealings. 3 neighbors have since built fences not because they're antisocial, but because they've learned the value of clear boundaries. Best part. Last weekend, I heard voices from Greg's backyard. He, his wife, and Brent were planning a deck project. They were comparing materials, discussing measurements, and Brent was sharing ideas from his coursework. Real family, real cooperation, real respect. Someone asked me, was it all worth it for a dock? And here's what I told them. Justice doesn't always require dramatic scenes. Sometimes it just needs one person who refuses to fold. I never set out to be a hero. I just wanted to drink coffee on the dock I worked hard to build. But when you stand firm, sometimes you end up protecting more than just yourself. I still wonder where Pamela is, probably dreaming up her next community project. But fences go both ways. They keep out harm, and they keep in what's worth protecting. I'm still here, every morning, coffee in hand. That fence, best investment I've ever made, not just for my property, but for what it stands for. Every board represents a choice between control and respect. And sometimes, when you draw that line and defend it, you don't just keep your peace, you help others find theirs. The lake is still. My coffee tastes right again. And that fence, still standing strong. If someone's inching into your space, making you second guess what's rightfully yours, don't back down. Hold your ground. You don't owe them silence. And if this story resonates, I'd love to hear yours.